She traveled 1,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met. But when Martha Evans stepped off that stagecoach into the blinding Texas sun, her promised husband wasn't there to greet her. There was just a single dusty street, a few tired wooden buildings, and a silence so deep it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. She clutched her small traveling case, the letter from William Hargrove burning a hole in her pocket. A letter that promised a new life, a home, a family for the 4 children who needed a mother. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. A voice cut through the silence. "Miss Evans?" She turned. It wasn't William. It was an old man with tired eyes and a stethoscope around his neck, a doctor. And beside him stood a little girl, no older than 11, with eyes as hard as stone. "I'm Dr. Blackwood," the man said. "This is Charlotte Hargrove." The girl, Charlotte, just stared. Her arms were crossed, her chin tilted up in a way that dared the world to challenge her. "Where is Mr. Hargrove?" Martha asked, her voice barely a whisper. The doctor's face fell, and the words he said next shattered Martha's world into a million pieces. "There's been an accident, ma'am. Mr. Hargrove was injured. He's alive. But he hasn't woken up." A coma. The man she was supposed to marry was in a coma. The little girl, Charlotte, finally spoke. Her voice was sharp, brittle. "You can leave. Go back north. Nobody would blame you." And in that moment, Martha realized she was facing a choice. She could run from this disaster, back to the lonely life she'd left behind. Or she could stay and fight for a family she didn't even know. But she had no idea what that fight would truly cost her. Because William Hargrove's accident was no accident at all. And the people responsible were just getting started. The wagon ride to the Hargrove homestead felt like a funeral procession. The silence was thick, broken only by the creak of the wheels and the doctor's occasional comments about the landscape. Charlotte sat as far from Martha as she could get, a tiny soldier guarding a broken kingdom. When they finally arrived, the house looked as weary as the children who spilled out onto the porch. 3 more of them. A boy of 9 with solemn eyes, a little girl clutching a one-armed doll, and the youngest, a boy of 4, peering out from behind his brother's legs. They were William's children, Benjamin, Abigail, and Michael, and their faces held no welcome. Just a deep, aching emptiness. Charlotte led the way inside. "He's in here," she said, her voice flat. The man in the bed was a stranger. His handsome face, the one from the photograph he'd sent, was slack and pale. A tube ran from his nose, and his hands lay still on his chest. This was William Hargrove, the man who had promised her a new beginning. Martha, the nurse who had seen the worst of the war, took a steadying breath. Her training kicked in. She assessed his breathing, the color of his skin, the stillness of his limbs. "Will he recover?" she asked the doctor. Dr. Blackwood just shook his head. "I can't say." Martha felt a cold dread creep into her soul. This was impossible. A man in a coma, 4 grieving, hostile children, a farm on the edge of ruin. Charlotte was right. She should leave. Anyone would. But as she stood there, paralyzed by indecision, Charlotte's voice cut through the silence again. "He wrote you another letter, just before it happened. He said he expected you'd still come." 4 pairs of eyes were fixed on her, waiting, judging, 4 lives hanging by a thread. And Martha knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that turning her back on them wasn't an option. Not anymore. That night, after the children were in bed, Martha sat beside William's still form. The house was quiet, filled with the ghosts of a life that had been violently interrupted. "I don't know what to do, Mr. Hargrove," she whispered into the darkness. "This isn't what I agreed to." As she stood to leave, her skirt brushed against a small table, knocking a book to the floor. It was a journal. William's journal. She knew she shouldn't. It was a violation of his privacy. But her hand moved on its own, picking it up, her eyes drawn to the last entry, written just 3 days before the accident. The words made her blood run cold. "If I don't make it, let her decide. The house, the land, the children. I trust her more than I trust my own damn luck." He had known. Somehow he had known something terrible was coming. This wasn't just a proposal of marriage. It was a desperate plea for help. Martha's hand trembled as she closed the journal. She looked at the man in the bed. this stranger who had placed the entire weight of his world in her hands. She reached out and took his warm, calloused hand in hers. "I'll stay," she whispered, the word surprising even herself. "I'll stay." She had no idea that her decision had just made her the new target. The men who had put William in that bed were still out there, and now they were coming for her. The next morning started with the sound of shattering glass. Michael, the youngest, had dropped a cup. He stood frozen, his eyes wide with fear, expecting a scolding. "It's all right," Martha said gently, her heart aching for this little boy who had already lost so much. As she cleaned up the mess, Michael asked the question that hung over the entire house. "Are you staying?" Before she could answer, Charlotte appeared. "Papa needs to be turned," she announced, her voice all business, "or he gets sores." "I know how," Martha said quietly. "I was a nurse during the war." For the first time, a flicker of something other than hostility crossed Charlotte's face. Surprise. Maybe even respect. The day was a blur of chores. Martha quickly saw that Charlotte, or Lahi, as the younger children called her, was trying to run the entire farm herself. It was too much for an 11-year-old. "I can help," Martha offered. "We don't need help," Lahi snapped back automatically. "I found your father's journal," Martha said, deciding to take a risk. "He wrote that he expected me to stay. He seemed to think something bad was going to happen." Lahi stared at her, her tough exterior cracking just a little. "That doesn't make any sense." "I know," Martha said, "but he trusted me. And I'm not leaving. Not today, at least." She made a list of supplies and took the wagon into the town of Thorn Creek. The general store was run by a woman with eyes as sharp as needles. "You're the mail-order bride," the woman, Mrs. Abernathy, stated. "Staying, are you? Even with him like that?" "Especially with him like that," Martha replied. Mrs. Abernathy's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You'll find folks here have long memories," she warned, her voice dropping. "Some won't take kindly to a northern woman taking up with one of our own." Then she leaned closer. "William wasn't the only one interested in oil. There are others who've had their eye on his land. They weren't pleased when he struck a promising vein." A chill went down Martha's spine. "Are you suggesting his accident wasn't an accident?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Mrs. Abernathy said, her face closing up again. "Just telling you to watch yourself." Just then, the bell on the door jingled. Two men walked in. One was smirking, the other had eyes as cold and dead as a snake's. They stopped when they saw Martha. "Well, well," the smirking one said. "You must be the bride we've heard about. Come all the way from up north to find a husband in a coma." Martha stood her ground. "If you'll excuse me, I have children waiting." The man, Ezra Clayton, blocked her path. "No hurry, Mrs. Evans to be. Planning on marrying a man who can't even say I do?" "Mr. Hargrove's condition is temporary," Martha said, her voice colder than ice. "Now please step aside." He moved, but as she walked past, he called after her. "You might want to ask those kids about the deed to that land. Interesting reading, I hear." The threat hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Martha walked out of the store, her heart hammering against her ribs. She now knew for certain. William wasn't the victim of an accident. He was the victim of an attack, and these were the men behind it. When Martha got back to the farm, another horse was tied to the fence post. A strange man stood on the porch. He was tall, bearded, and wore a gun on his hip. There was a hardness about him, but in the set of his jaw, she saw a clear resemblance to William. "You must be the letter writer," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Martha Evans." "Thomas Hargrove," he said, "Will's brother." He'd received a letter from William, too, a letter sent just days before the accident. Thomas reached into his saddlebag and pulled out another journal, wrapped in oilcloth. "Will sent this to me," he said, handing it to her. "His last one. Said if things went bad, one of us had to be a witness." "A witness to what?" Before he could explain, Lahi appeared at the door. "Uncle Thomas is staying for supper." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Martha and Thomas sat at the kitchen table. William's second journal lay between them. "Will knew they were coming for him," Thomas said grimly. "Men like Ezra Clayton." "I met them today," Martha said, her voice tight. "They threatened me." Thomas cursed under his breath. "They're moving faster than I thought." He pushed the journal toward her. You need to read this. Martha opened it. William's neat handwriting filled the pages, but the words were filled with a growing sense of dread. April 15th. Found Clayton measuring my north fence line. He claimed he was hunting, but he had no rifle. April 23rd. Sullivan offered to buy the West 40. The price was fair, but that's where the secondary vein runs. How did he know? May 2nd. Found a valve tampered with on the test well. No accident. Martha looked up, her heart pounding. He knew someone was sabotaging his work. Keep reading, Thomas urged. May the 10th. M. Evans has agreed to come. If anything happens to me, she'll have legal claim through marriage. The children will be protected. He hadn't just been looking for a wife. He'd been looking for a guardian, a protector. He was using their marriage as a shield for his children. But he never made it to the altar, Thomas said, voicing her fear. Without a will, and with you not legally his wife, the children are vulnerable. A court could appoint a guardian. And guess who has the judge in his pocket? Clayton. It was all a monstrous, greedy plan. Get rid of William, have the children declared wards of the state, and then seize control of the land and the oil beneath it. Martha turned to the final entry, dated the day of the accident. If I don't make it, the second map is with the deed in the floor safe. Trust only Evans and Thomas. The children must stay on this land. Their future depends on it. There's a map, Martha breathed, and a floor safe. Lahi knows where it is, Thomas said, but she doesn't have the combination. He looked Martha straight in the eye, his gaze intense. Now you know what you're really getting into, not just a sick man and 4 orphans. This is a land war, and men like Clayton play for keeps. Martha thought of the children sleeping upstairs. She thought of the man in the next room, who had trusted a stranger with everything he held dear. I survived a war, Mr. Hargrove, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I'm not easily frightened. A flicker of admiration crossed Thomas's face. It was the same look his brother had in his photograph. Determined. Unbreakable. Then we'd best get to work, he said. First thing tomorrow, we find that combination. But they weren't the only ones looking for what was in that safe, and their enemies were closing in, ready to tear the family apart to get it. The next morning, while tending to William, Martha noticed a photograph on his bedside table she hadn't seen before. It was of a pretty young woman holding a baby, surrounded by the other 3 children, their mother. Michael had told her his mother had left, but looking at the woman's restless, haunted eyes in the picture, Martha felt a strange pang of recognition. Some people run from things. She knew that all too well. As she adjusted William's pillow, Lahi appeared in the doorway. Uncle Thomas says someone's been in the barn, she said, her voice tight. The lock was broken. They were being watched, probed. The threat was no longer distant. It was right outside their door. Uncle Thomas asked about the safe, Lahi continued. Martha knew she had to trust the girl. Your father hid important papers in it, the deed to the land and a map. It's under the rug by the fireplace, Lahi said immediately. Papa showed me once, but he never told me how to open it. The hunt was on. Martha and Thomas spent the morning searching William's first journal, the one she'd found by his bed, for any clue, any series of numbers that could be the combination. Outside, the farm itself seemed to be under attack. Benjamin discovered another chicken missing from the coop, the latch tampered with. It was a small thing, but it was a clear message. A war of attrition. They were trying to starve them out, to make life so hard they would give up and leave. We're not leaving, Martha declared, looking at the children's worried faces. Later, as they stood near the silent oil derrick, Martha saw it. A figure on horseback, silhouetted on the distant ridge, watching them. He's been there most mornings since I arrived, Thomas said, his hand instinctively going to his gun. Never comes closer, just watches. It was a chilling reminder that they were isolated, exposed. Dr. Blackwood arrived for his daily visit, his face grim. He'd heard about the confrontation in town. Clayton and Sullivan are dangerous men, he warned Martha privately on the back porch. And the law is not on your side. You have no legal claim to these children or this property. The court could easily remove them from your care. And send them where? Martha shot back. To be separated and forgotten while men like Clayton steal their inheritance? Just then, Abigail's frightened voice called from inside. Papa moved. His eyes opened. They rushed to William's bedside. He was as still as ever, but Abigail was insistent. I was reading to him. His eyes were open. He was looking at me. Doctor, Blackwood was skeptical. Involuntary movements are common, he cautioned. Don't encourage false hope. But Martha wasn't so sure. Hope was all they had. After the doctor left, she sat with William, pleading with him. If you can hear me, give me a sign. Anything. There was nothing. Dejected, she stood up, and once again her skirt brushed the bedside table. William's journal fell to the floor. As she picked it up, a small piece of paper fluttered out. It was an old receipt, but written on the back was a series of numbers. 18, 7, 24, 3. Her heart stopped. Could this be it? She looked at William's still face. Was this his way of fighting back from the darkness? She didn't waste a second. With Thomas standing guard and Lahi watching with wide, hopeful eyes, Martha knelt by the fireplace and rolled back the rug. The iron door of the safe was cool beneath her trembling fingers. Right to 18, left to 7, right to 24, left to 3. A soft click echoed in the silent room. The lock had opened. Inside, nestled among a stack of papers, was the deed and a hand-drawn map. But as Martha pulled them out, a horrifying realization dawned on her. The documents revealed a secret far bigger than just oil, a secret worth killing for. And as that secret came to light, they heard the sound of hoofbeats outside. Riders approaching fast. Thomas peered through the window, his face pale. It's Clayton, and he's not alone. They had found the secret, but it was too late. Their enemies were at the door. Thomas's voice was a low growl. Get the children upstairs, now. Martha shoved the papers back into the safe, all except the deed, which she tucked into the pocket of her dress. She herded the terrified children up the stairs just as Thomas stepped onto the porch to face the men. That's far enough, Clayton, Thomas called out. We just came to pay our respects, Clayton sneered, his eyes fixed on the house, and make the new lady of the house a proposition. Martha's blood ran cold. She wouldn't hide. She walked out onto the porch and stood beside Thomas, her small frame radiating defiance. I'm here, Mr. Clayton, she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. And I'm not interested. Clayton's smile was predatory. Oh, I think you'll want to hear this. We're prepared to offer you $500, a generous sum for you to take these orphans and go back north where you belong. And the land? Martha challenged. The courts would likely sell it to cover William's debts, Clayton said smoothly. What debts? Thomas snapped. Will didn't owe anyone a dime. One of Clayton's men produced a ledger. According to county records, William took out a substantial loan last year, a loan that's now in default. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was their word against a forged document in a town where Clayton held all the power. This was their plan, not just murder, but a slow, legal strangulation. Martha clutched the deed in her pocket. Even if such a loan existed, it wouldn't affect the mineral rights, she bluffed, praying she sounded more confident than she felt. A flicker of surprise crossed Clayton's face. He hadn't expected her to know about that. You seem very well informed for a newcomer. I make it my business to understand my situation, she said coolly. His eyes narrowed. Our offer stands. $500. I suggest you consider it. You have no legal standing here. You're nothing to this family. He mounted his horse, his parting words a final, chilling threat. Think it over. There won't be another offer. As they rode away, Thomas turned to her, his face grim. You just made some dangerous enemies. They were already enemies, Martha replied, her gaze fixed on the dust cloud kicked up by their horses. Now they just know I'm not afraid to fight. But her bravery felt hollow. They were trapped. Clayton was manufacturing debts, and he had the local government on his side. What could she, a woman with no rights, in a wounded man, do against that? Just as despair began to set in, she remembered the map, the secret. She pulled Thomas back inside to the safe. Look, she said, unrolling the hand-drawn map. It showed the oil deposits William had found. But in the center of the property, he had drawn a large star. And next to it, a note that made her breath catch in her throat. Main deposit, potential largest in county. But that wasn't the explosive part. Below it, another note. Water table intact. Separate from oil. Unique formation. He didn't just find oil, Thomas breathed, his eyes wide with disbelief. He found water, Martha finished. Clean, fresh water, in the middle of Texas. In this dry, thirsty land, a source of clean water was more valuable than gold. It was more valuable than oil. It was the key to controlling the entire region. Now she understood. This wasn't just about greed. This was about empire. And they were standing right in the middle of it. The attack came not with guns, but with sickness. It started with Michael. One moment he was playing. The next he was burning with a fever that raged like a wildfire. Martha recognized the signs immediately. The high temperature, the telltale rash spreading across his small chest. Scarlet fever. Lahi, cool water, she commanded, her nurse's training taking over. Benjamin, ride for Dr. Blackwood. Tell him it's urgent. The farmhouse transformed into a hospital. The disease swept through the children with terrifying speed. By the next day, Abigail and Benjamin were also sick. By nightfall, even Lahi, who had been Martha's tireless helper, collapsed, her body finally surrendering to the fever. All four of them, sick, helpless. Martha and Thomas fought a desperate battle against an invisible enemy. They bathed feverish bodies, spooned broth and medicine into listless mouths, and sat through long nights listening to delirious cries. Michael was the worst. His fever wouldn't break. He tossed and turned, calling out for a mother he barely remembered. As the third night of the ordeal began, Martha felt her own strength failing. Thomas, his face etched with worry, watched her. "Should I fetch the preacher?" he asked, his voice low. The question hung in the air, a terrible admission of how close they were to losing. "Not yet," Martha whispered, though fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She was alone in the sick room, the weight of 4 small lives pressing down on her. In a moment of pure desperation, she went to William's room. She took his still, warm hand. "I don't know if I can do this," she confessed to his unconscious form, tears finally streaming down her face. "I can't lose them, William. Help me, please." And then she felt it, a squeeze, faint but unmistakable. His fingers tightened around hers. She froze, her heart hammering. "William, can you hear me?" Nothing. Had she imagined it? A trick of her exhausted mind? Whether it was real or not, it was the spark she needed. She would not give up. She went back to Michael's bedside and worked through the darkest hours before dawn, refusing to surrender. Just as the first gray light touched the sky, she must have drifted off for a second. A tiny voice woke her. "Mrs. Evans?" She looked down. Michael was looking back at her. His eyes were clear. The fever was gone. "I'm thirsty," he whispered. Relief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. "I had a dream," Michael murmured as she gave him some water. "Papa was there. He told me to be brave. He said to tell you he's still here." A child's fever dream, nothing more. But as Martha checked the other children, she found their fevers, too, had begun to recede. The crisis had passed. They were going to be okay. As the sun rose, Thomas spotted a rider approaching at a full gallop. It wasn't Clayton. It was a woman, riding astride like a man, her hair flying behind her. She reined her horse in sharply, her chest heaving. She looked at Martha, her face a mask of desperation and defiance. And in her features, Martha recognized the restless, haunted eyes from the photograph. "Where are my children?" the woman demanded. It was Sarah Hargrove, their mother. She had come back. Thomas stepped forward, his face a thundercloud. "Sarah? What the hell are you doing here?" "They're not alone," Martha said, finding her voice. Sarah's eyes narrowed, finally focusing on Martha. "And who exactly are you?" "This is Martha Evans," Thomas cut in, his voice dripping with contempt. "Will's fiancée, the one he wrote to after you abandoned your family." The return of the children's mother should have been a blessing, But Martha knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that it was the opposite. This wasn't a rescue. This was an invasion. And Sarah Hargrove's timing was far too perfect to be a coincidence. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sarah insisted on seeing the children, while Thomas looked ready to physically throw her off the property. It was Martha who broke the stalemate. "They're weak," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They've just been through a terrible illness. A shock could cause a relapse." She saw a flicker of genuine concern in Sarah's eyes. This woman wasn't a complete monster, but she was a complication they couldn't afford. "I'm staying in town," Sarah said, finally backing down. "I'll be back this afternoon." As she rode away, Martha had a sudden, chilling realization. The watcher on the ridge, the solitary figure who had been observing them for days. It hadn't been one of Clayton's men. It had been her, Sarah, casing the farm, waiting for the right moment to make her move. "This changes everything," Thomas said grimly after she was gone. "She signed away her rights when she left, but if the papers are lost..." If Sarah decided to fight for custody, she would become a powerful weapon for Clayton. A grieving mother manipulated into helping him steal her own children's inheritance. They had to act first. They had to legalize their position. The next day, leaving the recovering children with a watchful Dr. Blackwood, Martha and Thomas rode to the county courthouse. They had to file the deed to get the mineral and water rights officially on record, but they had walked right into a trap. Judge Wheeler, a man whose eyes were as cold as Clayton's, looked them over with disdain. "Funny you should bring this up," he said, steepling his fingers. "I've just received 2 petitions concerning the Hargrove property." He paused for effect. "The first is from Mr. Clayton, regarding a significant unpaid loan. The second is from Mrs. Sarah Hargrove, petitioning for full custody of her children." Martha's blood ran cold. It was happening. Clayton and Sarah were working together. "The loan is a fraud," Thomas insisted, "and Sarah signed away her rights." "So you claim," the judge said smoothly, "but I can find no record of such a document, and a mother's blood right is a powerful thing in the eyes of the law." The records had been wiped, disappeared. They had no proof. "I'm setting a formal hearing," the judge declared, 3 days from now, to settle the matter of the debt and the guardianship. 3 days. They had 3 days to find proof of Clayton's fraud and a missing legal document, or they would lose everything. The land, the children, everything. As they stumbled out of the courthouse, defeated, Thomas suddenly stopped. "The bank," he breathed. "Will had a safety deposit box for his most important papers. If those custody documents exist anywhere, they're in that box." It was a sliver of hope, but there was a problem. Only William had the key, and he was lying in a coma, unable to help them. They raced back to the farm, their minds reeling. Sarah was there again, reading to the children. She played the part of the loving mother perfectly, but Martha could see the calculation in her eyes. Later, Sarah approached Martha alone. "You should know," she said, her voice low. "Clayton approached me, offered me money to support his claim, to say that Will was unstable and that I should have the children." "And what did you tell him?" Martha asked, her heart pounding. Sarah's eyes flashed with a surprising fire. "I told him my children aren't for sale." She left soon after, leaving Martha and Thomas completely baffled. Was she telling the truth? Was this an act? A double cross? They had no time to figure it out. They had to find a way into that bank box. That night, Martha went through William's journals again, page by page, searching for any clue, any hint. She sat by his bedside, talking to him, telling him everything, pouring out her fear and frustration. "We need the key, William," she pleaded, clutching his hand. "Or a letter of authorization. Something. Anything." She felt the squeeze again, stronger this time, deliberate. Her head snapped up. His eyelids were fluttering. "William!" she cried out, her voice shaking. "William, can you hear me?" Thomas rushed in. They both watched, breathless, as William's eyes, cloudy at first, slowly began to focus. He tried to speak, but only a rough whisper emerged. "Ça, fait," he rasped. "Jour, nal." They had already searched the journal. What were they missing? Martha grabbed the book, her hands shaking. She flipped through the pages again. And then she saw it. Something she had overlooked a dozen times. In the back, tucked into a small leather flap on the inside cover, was not a key. It was a marriage certificate. It was signed by a traveling preacher, dated the week before Martha even left Ohio. It was also signed by two witnesses, Dr. Blackwood and Mrs. Abernathy from the general store. But the name of the bride wasn't Martha Evans. It was Sarah Hargrove. Martha stared at the document, the world tilting on its axis. Nothing made sense. Why would William have a recent marriage certificate with his ex-wife? The wife who had abandoned him? The date. It was dated just one day before the accident. William's raspy voice cut through her confusion. Not real, he whispered, his eyes pleading with her to understand. Fake. To stop her. It wasn't a marriage certificate. It was a forgery, a desperate, brilliant, and incredibly risky gambit. William, knowing Sarah might one day return and try to claim the children, had created a fake document, one that would prove they had reconciled and remarried, legally reestablishing his sole parental rights. He'd gotten his two most trusted friends in town to sign as witnesses to a document that would only be used as a last resort. He was protecting his children from their own mother. He was going to use this if Sarah ever came back, Thomas breathed, understanding dawning on his face, to show she'd returned to the marriage, voiding her ability to sue for custody from the outside. He was blocking her. But now it could be used against them. If Clayton found out about this, he could paint William as a forger, a fraud, and destroy his credibility completely. The bank box, William whispered, the effort costing him dearly. Key is the key. It was a riddle. The key is the key. Martha looked at the jumble of numbers and words in the journal again. What were they missing? Her eyes scanned the page where she'd found the safe combination. There were other numbers, other notes. She dismissed them as drilling calculations. Thorn Creek Bank, Box 113, Jeremiah 29:11. It wasn't a calculation, it was a Bible verse. Thomas grabbed the family Bible. He flipped to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 29, verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Hope, a future. It was William's favorite verse, but it wasn't a key. Wait, Martha said, her mind racing. The numbers, 29, 11. What if it wasn't just the verse? What if it was part of a combination? The box number was 113. What if the access code, the key, wasn't a physical key at all? What if it was a sequence? Box 1 and 13, verse 29, 11. 1 and 13, 29, 11. It was a long shot, a desperate guess, but it was the only one they had. The next morning, the morning of the hearing, Martha walked into the Thorn Creek Bank. Thomas stood guard outside. She approached the clerk, her heart hammering. I'm here to access William Hargrove's safety deposit box, she said, her voice miraculously steady. He gave me the access code. The clerk looked at her skeptically. And that is? Box 113, code 2911. The clerk went to the vault. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Martha could feel the eyes of everyone in the bank on her. If she was wrong, security would be called. Clayton would be alerted. It would all be over. The clerk returned carrying a long, thin metal box. He'd opened it. Martha took the box to a private room, her hands trembling so hard she could barely lift the lid. Inside, beneath a stack of geological surveys, was a thick envelope. And inside that envelope were the original, signed, and notarized custody papers. The documents where Sarah Hargrove voluntarily relinquished all rights to her children, and tucked within them was a letter in Sarah's own handwriting. William, I cannot be the mother they need. My demons are too strong. Take them. Raise them somewhere safe. Don't let me poison them as I have poisoned everything else in my life. It was the proof they needed, the silver bullet. But as she read the letter, she found something else, a second, smaller piece of paper. It was a bank draft, a withdrawal of $500 from William's account, made by Sarah. Dated the day she left 3 years ago. $500, the exact same amount Clayton had offered Martha to leave. It wasn't a random number. It was a symbol, the price for which Sarah had sold her children the first time. Clayton wasn't just trying to buy Martha off. He was mocking her. He was telling her that everyone has a price, and he had Sarah's receipt. The courtroom was packed. Clayton and his men sat on one side looking smug. Sarah sat alone, her face pale and unreadable. Judge Wheeler presided, his expression impartial, but his eyes cold. The hearing began with Clayton's lawyer presenting the forged loan documents. It was a slick, convincing performance. Then Sarah was called to testify. She spoke of her love for her children, of her regret at leaving. She painted herself as a victim, a lost woman who only wanted her family back. It was a masterful act. Martha could feel the sympathy in the room turning toward her. Finally, it was Martha's turn. The judge looked down at her. "Miss Evans, you are not a relative. You are not a legal guardian. By all accounts, you are a stranger here. What right do you have to speak on this matter?" "The right of a promise," Martha said, her voice clear and strong. "A promise made to a man who trusted me. A promise made to 4 children who deserve a future." She presented the deed explaining the water and mineral rights. She exposed the fraudulent nature of the loan, pointing out the inconsistencies. Then she turned her attention to Sarah. "Mrs. Hargrove," she said, her voice softening, "you speak of love for your children. I believe you, but I also believe you are a woman who is deeply lost." She held up the custody papers. "These are the documents you signed 3 years ago." A gasp went through the courtroom. Sarah's face went white. "And this," Martha continued, her voice ringing with power, "is a letter you wrote to your husband. A letter explaining why you had to leave." She didn't read the letter aloud. She didn't need to. She just let the sight of it hang in the air. "And finally," she said, pulling out the last piece of paper, "this is a bank draft for $500, the price you accepted to walk away from your children's lives." She looked directly at Clayton. "The same $500 you offered me." The courtroom exploded. Clayton jumped to his feet, his face purple with rage. Sarah was weeping silently, but Martha wasn't finished. "There is one more witness," she announced. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked Thomas Hargrove. And he was pushing William, awake, alert, sitting in a wheelchair. William couldn't speak much above a whisper, but he didn't need to. He pointed a trembling finger, first at Clayton, then at Sullivan. "They pushed me," he rasped, "tried to kill me. It was over." The lies collapsed like a house of cards. Clayton and Sullivan were arrested for attempted murder and fraud. Judge Wheeler, exposed as their accomplice, was disgraced. In the aftermath, Sarah, broken and ashamed, approached Martha. "He was right," she whispered. "I would have poisoned them. You saved them. From me." She turned and walked away, out of the courthouse and out of their lives for good. Weeks later, the Hargrove farm was beginning to heal. William was slowly regaining his strength, sitting on the porch while the children played in the yard. The oil derrick was being prepared to start pumping again, the future secured. Martha stood beside William's wheelchair, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky. "He called me Mother Martha today," she said softly, speaking of Michael. "It was the first time." William reached out and took her hand. His grip was still weak, but his eyes were filled with a love and gratitude that needed no words. This wasn't the life she had expected when she'd answered his letter. It was harder, messier, and more beautiful than anything she could have ever imagined. She hadn't just found a new beginning. She had found her home. She had faced down liars, thieves, and murderers. She had nursed a family back from the brink of death and despair. She had fought for her place in a world that tried to tell her she had none, and she had won. If you enjoyed this story of courage and justice on the Texas frontier, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more incredible true tales of survival and the unbreakable human spirit. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Martha's shoes? Until next time, stay safe out there.